All right, Saagar, what are you looking at?
Well, you all know that Jumanji meme. What year is it? It's a question I found myself seriously considering while trying to break all of this down for you. Together, we've already disregarded Munich in 1939 and the policy of appeasement as not particularly useful in our analysis of the Ukraine situation. But there are other historical parallels which are important and which I think could actually help all of you make sense of the rapidly changing world that we're in right now. I'm going to start with the most recent parallels and then go back from there. Immediately when Putin invaded Ukraine, what came to mind for me was the Soviet Premier Brezhnev's invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. There are several interesting parallels on both sides of the conflict. On the Russian side, it was an aggressive move that was made at the zenith of Soviet military power, but at a time when it was clear their economic system was stagnating. It was meant to project their power to the globe that you should not screw with the Soviet Union. Well, what ended up happening was a decade-long military imbroglio where 15,000 Soviet soldiers died and Soviet power was diminished worldwide, where the domestic Russian population actually rose up against a costly and unjust war that massacred civilians. On this side of the Atlantic, of course, things were also pretty similar at the outbreak of that invasion of Afghanistan. Jimmy Carter was president. He was weak and unpopular. But where that coincides is this. Brezhnev's invasion completely changed the bipartisan approach to Soviet Union at the time, known as détente. In effect, living in peace with the Soviet Union. The invasion was a great gift to the Cold War hawks in Washington and changed the bipartisan consensus with the election of Ronald Reagan to something called Rollback. Now, where the explicit aim in Rollback of American power was to confront Soviet power wherever it was and roll back its influence. A Russian invasion which empowers hawks and realigns global top politics towards a more aggressive stance. Does that sound familiar? An invasion which the military is a disaster and which could lead to big consequences domestically in Russia. Yeah, I think 1979 is a pretty spot-on analysis. If you were to ask me, it's probably the historical episode that rhymes with this one the most with where we are today, with some important caveats. Afghanistan is not Ukraine. Here, we're talking about Europe. So of course, a more dire scenario might actually even be more apt to look at. So let's keep going with the historical analogies. It's possible it's a mix of 1979 and Japan in 1940. We briefly touched on this yesterday. The Japanese Empire throughout the 1930s was undergoing a massive expansion through wars of territorial conquest, starting with Manchuria and China and expanding all throughout the Pacific. In 1940, Japan, as an ally of Nazi Germany, took advantage of the fall of France and invaded French Indochina, now known as Vietnam. The U.S. State Department, seeking to bolster its ally, decided to institute an oil embargo on Japan at the time. This was a big problem for Japan because they import about 80% of its oil from the U.S. at the time, and they needed that oil to continue their territorial conquest across Asia, including the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. So, Japan decided that the oil embargo was such an existential threat to their ability to carry out the war effort, they would then carry out a first strike on the U.S. at Pearl Harbor. Now, the important thing to consider in this parallel is this. The U.S. did not seek war with the Empire of Japan at that time, and in fact, undercounted how significant of a decision it was making when it cut Japan off from its oil supply. The decision to embargo Japan from oil was not even made by President Roosevelt. It was merely he was merely notified of it with no consideration at the top levels of the United States government. That action directly led to war, and it shows us the danger of how massive financial warfare, akin to the sanctions that we see in Russia right now, can go hot extremely quickly. And let's go further down the chain of what else is possible. The last and most terrifying possibility. This is 1914 all over again. A point I made yesterday, and I'm continuing to think is very important to understand, is we are in the very, very, very beginning of this crisis. The July crisis of 1914, which led to the outbreak of the First World War, it lasted a whole month. If you consider it in that context, this could be the beginnings of what's going to happen, the opening salvo in a very, very long war. And if it is July 1914, then here are the parallels that we see for today. First and foremost, the alliance system. Obviously with NATO membership in the Baltic states and Eastern Europe, where there is a literal nuclear tripwire if Russia invades or attacks those countries. But more troublingly, in my opinion, is the role of the European Union right now, which announced over the weekend that they were intended, although it's up in the air right now, to deliver fighter jets to the Ukrainian military for its use in the war against Russia. Furthermore, in the EU's announcement, the Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen said the Ukraine belongs in the European Union because, quote, they are one of us and we want them in. This was immediately followed up by President Zelensky of Ukraine, who officially signed the papers yesterday requesting immediate membership within the European Union. This move is, if accepted, is far from symbolic. It would increase the amount of Western military aid that Ukraine is entitled to, but even more so, the intersecting alliance system starts to rhyme with 1914. Think about this. Ukraine is part of the EU. Then the EU commits itself fully to their military defense. Well, when parts of the EU could then become embroiled in a war with Russia. Well, many member states of the EU will have to follow, right? Did I mention that a large portion of the EU is in NATO, which means if they go to war, that means we're going to war. Beyond the alliance system are the pleas from the sympathetic country for Ukraine to higher action for everybody. Zelensky begged Biden yesterday to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine, telling him he would win the war if the West, quote, could do their part. In effect, Zelensky is asking the United States to declare war on Russia, shoot down Russian aircraft, and start World War III, increase the chance of a nuclear confrontation between the US and Russia. That's madness. Absolute madness. But in times of madness, the unthinkable become thinkable. Nobody in July 1914 thought that a Serbian territorial dispute would become a great war. And yet, compare Zelensky's plea to this telegram from the Prince of Serbia to the Tsar of Russia. Quote, "It is impossible for us to defend ourselves. We supplicate your majesty to give us your aid as soon as possible. The highly prized goodwill of your majesty makes us hope firmly that our appeal will be heard by his generous Slav heart." Yeah, as we all know, the Tsar gave in and he guaranteed Serbia's security. He ended up paying the price with his life and the lives of hundreds of thousands of his own soldiers. I'll end with a quote that I read yesterday, but which is so immensely important from Robert McNamara. He was a Secretary of Defense during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Quote, "I want to say, and this is very important, in the end, we lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war. We came that close to nuclear war at the end. Rational individuals. Kennedy was rational. Khrushchev was rational. Castro was rational." I just think that that quote is so incredibly important for people to understand and to also to think about it whenever.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.